Thank you very much. Can you hear me out there? Am I on? Good. Thank you very much, Tom, for the introduction. It's a genuinely great opportunity to spend some time with Graham Allison this morning here in New York, New York. Graham is a seriously bright guy. And it's not just because we read his stuff. As a junior woodchuck in the Australian Foreign Service, we were reading Essence of Decision, his diagnostics of the Cuban Missile Crisis, written, 10 years after the event?
Yep.
About 1973, reflecting on the events of 63. It's probably the best piece of what I'd describe as foreign policy analysis, that is, decision-making theory within administrations, about how they actually deal with crises. It's the defining text on, as it were, crisis management applied to real-life situations. And you couldn't get something more real-life than the events of 1963 over Cuba, where we came within a 1 in 3 chance, according to President Kennedy at the time, of going to nuclear war. After I left politics in Australia, I was in search of political asylum. These guys at the Harvard Kennedy School put out a notice saying they'd welcome refugees from Australia. So I came. And I spent a terrific year in 2014 sitting at Graham's feet and the other scholars at the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School. And that's when we began talking about what Graham has spent the last several years writing, which is this extraordinary book. And he was the first to admit that his background is not a China guy, but his phenomenal reading and his deep familiarity with those in this country who are China guys, led by the great man himself, Henry Kissinger, but also his deep reflections and conversations over decades with Lee Kuan Yew. Captured in a book co-edited between himself and Bob Blackwell on Conversations with the Master, I think you entitled it, reflect a deep capacity to understand some of the dynamics at work within the Middle Kingdom, particularly those which apply to its regional and global behaviour. Add to that the fact that this is a guy who's seriously experienced and seasoned in the politics and praxis of US national security policy administration, having worked in the Pentagon, and knowing most of the folks that do stuff in the American system. And so you have a scholar, you have someone who has followed the China business for a long time and has worked with the Americans in the field who are the best in the game, and a US public policy, national security policy practitioner. Apart from all that, as we'd say in Australia, he's a decently good bloke. And he likes a beer on a cold day. We've spent many a time, and a hot day as well, and we've spent many a day and many an evening talking about this and other themes which relate to the future preservation of what we'd call the global rules-based order. So enough from me. This book essentially sorts itself into 2 boxes. One's the diagnostics, what's actually happening out there, and what's happening in particular in the global order as shaped by the emergence of China and its relationship with the United States, the established power for the purposes of the analogy. The second part of the book is a series of questions pointing to what do we now do prescriptively in terms of the future of the global-based order, rules-based order, which is centred in US power. But let's come to that second, because as Graham would admonish us all, both directly and indirectly through the people he quotes copiously through the book, it's far better we spend time getting the diagnostics right, the analytics right of what is actually happening before we go into the classic Washingtonian response is, what are we going to do about it? We've got to do something about it. What are we going to do about it this afternoon? Which, having been in politics myself, is usually the quality advice you get from those immediately advising you around you, which is, don't panic too much. So the analytics is the first part, the great strength of the book. So let's start there, Graham, in terms of the book itself. Perhaps for the good folks in the audience, a word or two about the most succinct definition of the trap itself as identified by Thucydides, and why you came to it as an analytical framework looking at China and the United States.
So thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you, Josette, for having me here. I'm a big fan of the Asia Center, and I'm a big fan of Josette, who spent a year at Harvard or two, but then escaped to here, and especially appreciative for Kevin for the kind words, and also for, as I say in the acknowledgments of the book, I've had a few tutors on China. Henry Kissinger was my professor longer ago than he or I can remember, and he's been trying to teach me ever since, but as he points out, I'm a slow learner. Lee Kuan Yew, I had the good fortune to know over many, many decades, and I think kept reminding me there's a big country out there and you should know more about it. And Kevin, we had the great good fortune to have with us in Harvard for a whole year, where as part of a China working group, I got almost daily tutorials. So I would say thank you, especially to Kevin. But I want to underline the proposition, I do not claim to be a China scholar. I am not a China scholar. I'm a student of China. I'm fascinated by China. I've been trying to understand it or study it for more than a decade. But I don't read Mandarin. I don't speak Mandarin. I listen to people who I think have insights into the picture, and I remain both fascinated and puzzled. So I am a student of national security and of American foreign policy and American national security. And I think as I try to look and ask what's happening in the world and what's happening to basically the international order that's been the foundation for an anomalous, historically anomalous, long peace among great powers, I came upon the proposition that one's seeing a basically hegemonic transition or shift in which the order that the U.S. was able to establish when it controlled half of the market share of the world. So go back to 1945 or 50, U.S. GDP is about half of the world's GDP. Was not something that was sustainable, in which the U.S. market share had shrunk to 18% or 16% and was on a trajectory to go even smaller. And then as I tried to get my head around that, I noticed that actually the big increase in market share had come in the part of another country, China, which in 1980 was about 2% of the world GDP and is now about 17 or 18% of world GDP. So you can't imagine a market in which the market shares change that much without a change in the fundamentals. And I, as a realist in international relations studies, start with the structural realities. So looking into space, I remembered when I was a student in college in North Carolina at Davidson College, where I went originally, I took a course in ancient Greek, and the professor teaching me ancient Greek in the first year said, okay, you guys have to learn vocabulary, and you're going to learn how to write in Greek and whatever, but if you work very hard in the first year, in the second year, you may, and he held out as the prize, be able to read Thucydides. And in the first year, we read Xenophon's Anabasis. But in the second year, if you work really, really hard, you can read Thucydides. And Thucydides, he would say it with a reverence and exuberance that just sort of, I thought, okay, Thucydides, I need to learn about this guy. So he thought that unless you could read in the original Thucydides, you would never appreciate the steeple of civilization, as he put it, which was classical Greece. That here in Athens in particular, people created something that had never existed in the world before or after. So what did they do? They invented everything. So they invented professional navies. That was what caused fear in Sparta a lot. But they also invented drama. Sophocles, Aristophanes, philosophy. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, democracy, Pericles. So basically, across the spectrum, architecture. Look at the Parthenon. You can't find a finer building in the world today. So how did this happen? So Thucydides tells us in this account in the Peloponnesian War, and you don't really, to go back to Tom's earlier, you don't have to read all 600 pages. You can go to your Kindle and download this for free today. Read just book 1, the first 100 pages. It's brilliant. It's not good. It's brilliant. I mean, stunning. You'll learn 100 wonderful things just in that one book. So, but among the things Thucydides taught us was, quote, he was writing about the conflict that destroyed the two great city-states of ancient classical Greece, Athens and Sparta. And he said, quote, it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made the war inevitable. So that's the rise, fear, inevitable. He's got two factors, a rising power. He's got the psychological dimension or the perceptual dimension that became fear in Sparta, and war. Now, inevitable is a strong word, and actually, as I argue in the book, if you read Thucydides in the original, and even if you read it just in the English, you'll see he understands that's hyperbole. This is exaggeration for purposes of emphasis. He just means very likely, not 100%, but that's the way to bet it. So I then seized upon this idea, Thucydides' idea, and as Henry Kissinger says, if you want a lens for understanding what's happening in relations between China and the U.S. today, this is the best lens available. Because if you look through this lens, you'll see beneath the news of the day about whatever happened in the South China Sea or the East China Sea or the Korean Peninsula or China becoming the #1 trade partner with Germany or whatever, beneath the news and the noise, you can look into the substructure and see a dynamic, which is a rising power, more and more creating fear and anxiety in a ruling power. And that's the principal dynamic of the relationship today. So I think that's an overly long answer, but I think I would urge you, don't miss Thucydides. There's a fantastic read there that's for free, and don't miss then the attempt to use this in understanding what's happening today, and as it's reflected through my trying to look at the last 500 years, which is why this book took me 5 years, that each one of these cases is a wonderful case. And you can go to the website that's put up in conjunction with the book. It's called the Thucydides Trap website, where you can get an account of each of these, plus reader's guide to other literature on each one of the subjects. And we're inviting people to identify additional cases, because I don't believe these are all the cases. These are just all the cases I've been able to find in which a rising power threatened to displace a major ruling power.
It's a great list. If you go to the book, and I strongly suggest that you get a copy, page 244 is a list of the 16 case studies. And it's a wonderful, pithy, one-line, 5-box summary of what happened in 16 cases of history. And the categories are period, ruling power, rising power, domain, and result. Okay, give you one example. Late 15th century, Portugal, Spain, domain, global empire and trade. You remember what the result was? The arbitration, if you like, with the Pope and the division of the then New World between Spanish and Portuguese spheres of influence. Result, no war. But in Graham's 16 case studies, how many of the 16 result in no war? 4. The others have a somewhat more calamitous result, called war. It's a good read. So what you say about China-US, I think, is insightful. On China specifically, you quote elliptically, but I think elegantly, Václav Havel, a truly great and insightful poet of both politics and international relations. I think the Havel quote goes well with China. You say, to paraphrase former Czech President Havel, the rise of China has happened, quote, so quickly that we have not yet had time to be astonished. It's a really insightful quote. I mean, I've been banging this drum a bit since I've come to America, and I think I found as a foreigner coming here that it was actually hard to find resonance with the reality of what I could see, feel, and touch in our own, let's call it, Asian hemisphere. But that's by way of poetic description. Then you get down to what I describe as your two hard and, I would say, sharp points, which you phrase as follows. Having said that war between China is not inevitable, you go on and say this, the United States and China can likewise avoid war, but only if they can internalize two difficult truths. First, on the current trajectory, war between the US and China in the decades ahead is not just possible, but much more likely than currently recognized. Much more likely than currently recognized. Indeed, on the historical record, war is more likely than not. By understanding the danger, moreover, we add to the risk. If leaders in Beijing and Washington keep doing what they have done for the past decade, the US and China will almost certainly wind up in war. The second point he goes on to, Graham that is where he says war is not inevitable, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But on the first part of the diagnostic, which is it's happening, it's there, you've pointed the economic dynamics, you haven't yet referred to, let's call it, the military dynamics of the relationship, but they're obviously in the book. But these are very sharp observations that on the balance of history would lead us to conclude that it's more likely than not, and it's certainly more likely than at present and hitherto has been recognized, at least in this country.
Well, so, I mean, if I were to summarize in one line, I would say business as usual will produce history as usual. But if I jump to the other side of the proposition, the cliche, but it's a deep truth that says only those who fail to study history are condemned to repeat it. So let me talk about each side, but I'll stay with the first one. So go back to what was happening 100 years ago today. Actually, just last month, 100 years ago today, the Americans, as Australians like to say, were a late arrival in World War I. The Australians having been there fighting with the Brits ever since 1914.
And the Second World War.
And the Second World War. But in the First World War, the U.S. showed up especially late. From an Australian point of view, as an Australian Chief of Staff was pointing out to me recently. But in any case, 100 years ago, World War I was going on. So question, how could the assassination of an Archduke in Sarajevo by a Serbian terrorist, I mean, again, if we were making this up for students, they can't believe it. Not a terrorist, you know, they've heard of terrorists now, but 100 years ago, a Serbian terrorist could have been the match that created a fire that produced a conflagration so devastating that at the end of it, historians felt it necessary to create a whole new category called World War. So that's why it's called World War I. This is the first time a world war. So you think, wait a minute. So it must have been because the great powers wanted to go to war. No, they did not want to go to war. Well, what was going on? And I look at this and say, we see the rise of Germany. So Germany, when it gets reunified by Bismarck about 1870, is about half the size of Britain, GDP. By 1900, it's equal. By 1914, it's a quarter larger. So Britain is seeing a rising Germany. This creates the structural condition that Thucydides described, in which a rising power very naturally thinks, I'm bigger, I'm stronger, I deserve more say, I deserve more sway. The current arrangements are confining. They're actually constricting my normal and natural growth. The arrangements that currently exist probably didn't take account of my interests when I was smaller and weaker. And the ruling power, Britain, looks and says, wait a minute, who's preserved the peace in Europe all these many, many years in which you've been able to unify and create a country and try to build a? So the rising power syndrome, as I describe it in the book, and the ruling power syndrome, one sees repeated over and over in every case. Very normal, very natural. In fact, in the book I have a little description. I don't go off at length, but this phenomenon is not unique to nations. Last night I was at a event making a presentation, and David Rubenstein asked me, well, if you had 15 minutes to explain this to President Trump, how would this be possible? So I said, well, I thought it might be. I thought it might be that basically I would say, think about the real estate world in which you have an established real estate company, and now you have an upstart or an incumbent like the taxi industry or like Microsoft, and you have Uber or you have Google or you have Apple. So when an upstart is challenging an incumbent, you get this similar dynamic. Even you can see it in gorillas. When you have the alpha gorilla that's in any hierarchical dominant system, and you have the wannabe, you watch the relationship. So I think there's something extremely normal and natural about this. And I think as one looks at it, people today, to get now to specifically your question, for most Americans today, the idea of war among or between great powers is simply inconceivable. Because why? For 7 decades, this has been consigned to the dustbin of history. So it hasn't happened, so it can't happen. So we don't have wars between great powers anymore. Wars are things that happen with little powers, or where the U.S. goes off to some, to which the answer is, now wait a minute, if I look at history, that's not correct. And particularly where one sees a shift in the underlying fundamentals of power, the underlying correlates of power, there's structural stress. And under conditions of structural stress, events that would otherwise be inconsequential or manageable, like the assassination of an Archduke, can produce consequences that are virtually inconceivable to the parties at the time. If we go again, stay with World War I, at the end of World War I, every leader of every country had lost what he was trying to achieve most. So the Austro-Hungarian emperor is trying to hold together his empire. His empire is dissolved and he's gone. The Russian Tsar is trying to back up the Serbs. His regime has been overthrown by the Bolsheviks, so he's gone. The Kaiser in Germany is trying to back up his buddy in Vienna. He's gone. Okay? France is trying to protect its position. It's been bled of its youth for a whole generation, never recovers after World War I. And Britain, which has been a great creditor nation, is turned into a debtor and has lost most of its generation of leadership. So you look and you say, give these people a chance for a do-over. None of them would have made the decisions he made. None. So in the current condition where you have structural stress, events like, and my candidate for today would be North Korea, can be a spark that produces an outcome that no one could imagine. So there's nobody that I know of in Washington who thinks war with China would be a good idea. Nobody. There's nobody, I believe, in Beijing that thinks war with the U.S. would be a good idea. So does that mean that war could not happen? The answer is no. Again, go back and look at World War I. It was not that people wanted war. It was that they wanted to back up my buddies, the Serbs, or I wanted to punish the Serbs for having assassinated the Archduke, or I wanted to stick with my ally, and one thing led to the other. So I think the danger in this situation is not that parties conclude, okay, I'm just not having it, you can't rise anymore, I'm going to attack you, or I've now got so big and strong that I'm going to attack you. Not at all. That other conditions, other circumstances, become the triggers.
There's 2 points which arise out of that. And again, we're sticking to the analytics at present, not the question of what do we do about it all. On the analytics, because you've got to be confident the analytics hold.
Sure.
And it will come as no surprise to anyone in this room that I broadly share Graham's analytics. And I've been beaten this gong for quite a long time, including before I came to the United States.
Well, in fact, a lot of my analytics reflect some instruction from Kevin, which I have appreciated greatly, and you'll see him frequently quoted in the book as one of the tutors on these points.
And despite that, the book will still sell well. But what I was going to go to is this. On the analytics, of course, you and I are both aware of the counter-argument, which seemed much more fashionable a few years ago than perhaps it is today. There is something uniquely globalizing about the post-45 reality, and certainly the post-91 reality of international relations, which creates such a deep structural, quote-unquote, change in the nature of international relations, which is to do with interconnectedness and the drivers of it through global capital, global technology, and global people movements, that historical pre-45 assumptions about the autonomous actions of nation-states colliding as billiard balls in the atmosphere, in classical, quote, Hobbesian realism, is no longer relevant. Okay, and now that's what is the argument that's been thrown at this line of analysis for a long time, and there are a whole lot of analytics to back it up, and it's my own observations echoing a bit like yours, which was, it just doesn't seem rationally to be in anyone's interest to head down this path. It would be bad for business. It would be enormously destructive. So why rationally would anyone do this? So let me just pick your thoughts on that one first before I go to my second provocative observation.
So again, I agree completely that first, let me reiterate what you said. So when I teach my course at Harvard about this, I start with the proposition, as Kevin is doing today, diagnosis precedes prescription. This seems like a radical idea, only in policy making. Only in policy making. So if you go to a doctor and you're feeling bad and he says, jump on the gurney, we're taking you in for an operation, and he hasn't diagnosed you, run away, okay? Get a second opinion. So diagnosis precedes prescription. Until we have worked hard to understand the situation, don't decide that we should cut you or do whatever, okay? So I would say that's a good analogy in medicine, and it's great for policy making. It's very strange in Washington, okay? So don't just stand there, do something, is the Washington mantra. So we're trying to, first as Kevin is and it's what I try to do in the book, diagnosis precedes prescription. So if you don't understand the situation, do not intervene in any significant way, especially like surgery, okay? So in this case, maybe, and certainly some critics of the book have argued this. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Maybe the world has changed so much that the lessons of history pre-1945 no longer apply. And that's certainly been an attractive idea for some students of international relations. We now live in an international rule-based order in which the world is so integrated and so globalized that war is obsolete. Okay? That basically it's so obviously devastating and so obviously counterproductive that nobody would want war, and so nobody will go to war. And I think you can find lots of books and articles that argue this. So I go back to start with Thucydides. Thucydides was actually the founder and father of history, as we know it. History that tries to give an account of what actually happened. And as he says at the beginning of his book on the Peloponnesian War, I'm writing this book for successors, leaders, generals, thinking citizens, because, he says, as long as human beings are human beings, the future will more or less resemble the past. That's his claim. And I believe that's basically a sound claim. I think when I read the Corinthian ambassador trying to explain to the Athenian assembly, to the Spartan assembly, who the Athenians were, I can almost feel like I'm in the room listening to the person. I understand their the debate. I understand the considerations.
It's like Australians trying to explain China to Americans.
Completely. I mean, these are people part of the same race, part of the same species, whose reflections, rationality, irrationality, emotions are not exactly like me, but enough that these are their behavior. You cut them and they bleed. Cut me and I bleed. There's a lot of similarities between Athenians and Americans, or Spartans and Americans. So in the current situation, of course, there's some radically different features. And some of them are the items from which one would hope to build, as Kevin has argued in a very excellent piece that I promote often on constructive realism. So if you were trying to imagine China and America saying, well, look, we don't have to repeat all of them. We're understanding we're the inheritors of human life for the last few millennia. But we don't have to repeat the mistakes of the previous past. And there are a lot of things that are new and different in our current situation. So one big new difference is nuclear weapons and mutually assured destruction, which in the relationship between the U.S. and China means that war, if it became all-out war, might succeed in killing all of us. So once you get that point understood deeply, you discover anybody who proposes, well, this is a good day for war, I always tell them, okay, translate that. This is a good day in which to commit suicide. So think about it, you know. Maybe you don't need to do it today. Maybe you think about it till tomorrow, you know. We'll think about it a little harder. So this is a fundamental element. Secondly, as you point out, Kevin, economically. The U.S. and China are now so integrated economically that if there were a war between the U.S. and China, there would be nothing to buy in Walmarts, and Chinese factories wouldn't have any reason to be making the products because there wouldn't be anybody to take them. And besides, the U.S. wouldn't be able to get loans to cover our deficits. So that doesn't seem like a good idea. Then there's climate. And while President Trump may not like the idea, the facts are that if the U.S. were to go on a tear and do everything conceivable to try to make a livable climate, and China were just to keep doing what it's doing, there's no solution. And vice versa. If China were to do everything it could conceivably do and the U.S. were to do just what we're doing, there's no conceivable solution. So as the Paris Accord, as you pointed out often, is at least a small first step towards recognizing if we want a livable environment, all the parties have to find some way to work together with respect to this, and especially the two biggest powers. So there are a lot of elements that are new and different that one could use for constructing something. That's on the one hand. But on the other hand, as I argue in the book, if I were Chinese, and as I talk to Chinese colleagues, they're sitting in Beijing and they look out and they say, tell me again, why is the U.S. Navy the arbiter of events in the South China Sea? Why is the U.S. Navy flying along our border every day, running patrols? And I say, we are the guardians of the global rule-based order. We have been here as the dominant military power since Midway. We've created a set of economic and social and political and security arrangements that have allowed you, China, the longest period of peace and the fastest growth you ever saw in 5,000 years. You should actually be helping to pay for some of these services, okay? And
that gets lost in translation.
Exactly. My Chinese colleagues say, as I say in the book, they say, look at your own map. What is the name of this sea that's on our border? It's called the South China Sea, not South American Sea, or not South. Then there's the other one. It's called the East China Sea. So I have a little section called China Seas, China Seas. Okay? So they look, they think, well, so there would be no risk of a collision between American and Chinese airplanes or American and Chinese ships if you simply were out of there. So just out of there. So we're not patrolling the Caribbean. We're not patrolling Seattle and the West Coast. So why are you there? So I go back to my first lecture. We've been there for 70 years. We've provided this interaction. They say, that was then, and thank you. Okay, even sometimes they will say thank you. But now is now. Okay? And I have in the book a chapter that many Americans will find very uncomfortable, but that I think Kevin liked, which is basically, what if Xi's China were just like us? So Kevin has heard many lectures from Americans, and I've given many lectures to foreigners about why they should be just like us, okay? Especially the Chinese. They love this lecture, and Japanese. If you were just like us, everything would be fine. To which the answer is, well, let me think. How did that work out? So when the U.S. was emerging to what we were confident was going to be an American century, Teddy Roosevelt was the personification of this. And Teddy Roosevelt went to Washington in 1897 to become the #2 person in the Navy. He was 37 years old. He had for 15 years been railing about the abomination, as he called it, of the Spanish who were in our hemisphere, in Cuba, on an island, 90 miles away from our shore. And the Germans who had their ships patrolling in the Western Hemisphere. And the British.
And the British.
And the British. So what happened in the next decade, and you can read about it in the chapter, which is quite fun. Okay. One, there's a mysterious explosion in a ship in Havana, never yet fully, but in any case, the U.S. immediately seizes upon it, declares war against Spain, defeats Spain, liberates Cuba, takes Puerto Rico, takes Guam. That's how the U.S. got Guam. Secondly, sponsors a coup in Colombia because it's not willing to give us a canal, creates a new country, Panama, which the next day gives us a contract for a canal. Okay? Third, threatens war with both Britain and with Germany over territorial disputes in Venezuela, where we say, if you don't butt out, we'll have a war. So they butt out. Okay? And then, the thing I like the most, steals most of the fat tail of Alaska from Canada. So if you go look at your map, you'll see Alaska is a big blob, and then there's a 500-mile tail that separates Canada from the sea. Includes Tongass National Forest, which is the biggest American national forest, with a wonderful river called the Stickeen River. I go fishing in that river, okay, in the summer sometimes. So how did we come to have this? That's a long story, and you can read about it. But John Muir was the founder of the Sierra Club and the Nature Conservancy. He did the Yosemite. He was also a buddy of Teddy Roosevelt's, okay, as a naturalist. So he went in his canoe up to Canada, up to Alaska, exploring glaciers. And he writes back to Teddy Roosevelt, I've been on the Sticking River. He says, it's like 100 Yosemites. And Teddy Roosevelt
He knew
says...
how to pitch an argument.
He did. Teddy Roosevelt says, that sounds like America to me. And his Secretary of State says to him, excuse me, this is Canada. He says, this is not Canada. This is America. Look at this, 100 Yosemites. And so he basically threatens war over this territory, which we take. So we didn't even have to pay for it. One last line. He then announces the Roosevelt Corollary. Again, imagine the Xi Jinping corollary. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine says what? In our hemisphere, that's the whole Western Hemisphere, if any government behaves in a way that we think is unfitting, we will send the Marines and turn the government over. And every year thereafter, for the next decade, he sends the Marines to some country in the Western Hemisphere to change its government. So I would say maybe we don't want China to be just like us.
Which is why when the same Teddy Roosevelt sent the Great White Fleet to Australia in 1907, 8,
Yeah.
We observed with respect and decided that this was a government we should engage fulsomely and diplomatically. One final question on the analytics, and I'm sorry we're not getting onto prescription straight away, but getting the analytics right is so important. You've dismissed, and I've largely agreed with you, let's call it the globalization argument against these underlying continuing historical determinants, though you've noted one big caveat, which is we're in a nuclear age. The second counter-argument against, let's call it the Thucydidean analytic is culturally specific, which says that there is something particular to Chinese culture, or for that matter, even particular to aspects of post-45 American culture, and I use culture in the broadest possible term here, which render the possibility of a global war or even a regional war between these two great powers not possible or highly improbable. Just to expound on that a little bit, in the case of the Chinese tradition, it's never been involved in a significant maritime conflict in its 5,000 years of a continuing history, despite the fact that in the Middle Ming, it actually was probably the largest naval power in the world. It decided to go and trade with folks, not to colonize and certainly not to engage in armed conflict to seize territories anywhere from Southeast Asia to South Asia to the Middle East, and it could have. And there's something self-referential about the Chinese historical and cultural tradition which says we've got enough stuff at home with this big country to hold it together, and we just want to have secure boundaries, and so we're not really all that interested, frankly, in what let's call it colonial powers of the type that they've observed elsewhere had engaged in, from Rome through to the British, and to some extent, as they would see it, the Americans post-45 world. There's another one which is kind of the American cultural tradition, which is notwithstanding the Rooseveltian exception, and I think most would accept this was a pretty remarkable period in American history under Teddy's reign, which everywhere from Manila Bay to Cuba, you name it, it was kind of the Monroe Doctrine on speed and spreading in both directions. But basically, the tradition, which is we don't meddle in foreign wars, and we don't meddle in the old politics of Europe, and we certainly have never engaged in a great power struggle with another great power over a sphere of influence other than in the Western Hemisphere. Now, I posit that, and I stand to be corrected. And there's something militating against that predisposition in the American culture as well. So throwing those two out of left field at you on the cultural side, because culture affects politics, affects national consciousness, and the ultimate question is, are you going to let these elites do this sort of stuff and have a war? Even if they're Chinese elites in a non-democratic system, let alone if you're one here. So there are a couple of thoughts to play with.
Great thoughts. So, again, I'm still studying China and trying to learn about it. But and it's certainly the Chinese point out, and I think you and Henry and even Lee Kuan Yew agree that the Chinese have not been imperialistic in the Western tradition. So, as Henry points out, the Chinese don't create colonies and require other people to follow because they don't think they're good enough. They don't think they can. The Chinese superiority complex is so distinct that you can't become Chinese. You speak better Mandarin than most Chinese, but if you go try to become Chinese, they say, forget about it. You're not Chinese. You don't look Chinese. You're not born Chinese. You're not ethnically Chinese. So Chinese have a superiority.
Australia, they call me the Manchurian candidate.
And again, as Henry's account, and this is Lee Kuan Yew's as well, Chinese basically want other people to try to be like Chinese, and they actually reward you for how close you come. So you're very respected in China because you speak Mandarin so well. So this is a great sign of respect, but you're never going to be Chinese. Okay, and in the Chinese international tradition, people are graded by the tributary states by how closely they approximate China, and if they show respect, actually, if you come and show respect to the emperor, he rewards you. So he's not trying to control your life. He's not trying to govern your territory. He's not trying to take your land. He's not trying to expand.
But he does limit your absolute freedom.
He does, because again, the number one injunction from Confucius is know your place. Okay? And your place is located in a hierarchy in which there's the top of the pyramid, that's us, and then everybody else is located appropriately. I think in the American case, I think, as Henry points out, it's a good thing that you have two states that are competitive with superiority complexes because only one of them is missionary. That's us. So Americans believe, again, this is a little bit of a caricature, but most Americans, I think, if you scratch and believe, everybody really wants to be Americans. Okay? Every country, if they were given a choice, wants to be like us. And that's what our Constitution says, and our Declaration of Independence. Every person has human rights, the same. Everybody wants to be part of governing themselves. Everybody wants to have a democratic government like ours. Now, I think as we continue performing so brilliantly, the appeal of this may actually wane a little bit, especially with the current dysfunctional form of, but still, underneath, I would say, caricaturing only slightly, Americans think everybody wants to be part of America, and globalization was really another word for culturally appropriate Americanization. So the international order that the U.S. built was largely, again, most people miss this, not Kevin, was largely first and foremost about conflict with an adversary who was judged to be even worse than the Nazis. So Soviet communism on the march, as George Kennan's wonderful telegram of 1946 says, is a greater threat to us as a society than Nazism was, which we've just been fighting for the World War II. And that stirred up the conversation from which ultimately emerged the Cold War strategy. The Cold War strategy, which included these elements, which we now call the elements of the international order, were really constructed first and foremost for fighting the evil empire. And I'm an old Cold Warrior. I was part of that fight. I think it actually was a good fight. And I think it was a good strategy. And I think the evil empire was evil. And I think it's a good thing it went away, defeated. But if you said, what was NATO about? NATO was not about building a new international order. NATO was about having a economic center of gravity on our side. In the war against the Soviet Union, what was the U.S.-Japanese Mutual Defense Treaty about? It was about another party that was judged to be geoeconomically important that was helping to fight the Soviet Union. So in the period after, and I think that worked very well, and that was an American involvement in the world for the period that ran to the end of the Cold War in 1991. And as I argue in the book, I think since 1991, having succeeded, the U.S. to some extent has lost its way in terms of a strategy for trying to cope with the world. And I think that's the place where we find ourselves now.
We'll go to Q&A now, and we've kind of been dealing a lot with the analytics, and I'm happy for the questions to go whichever way you wish. but also now onto the hoary question of where to now, and what does this mean? And paraphrasing something Graham just said, which he also wrote in this great book of his, he said part of the interest and underpinning rationale for the book is to stir up the debate. I think he would see this as a precursor to another long telegram from Kennan with as yet to be determined content and certainly as yet to be determined final response, but certainly being the agent provocateur within the body politic here and the national security body politic to start people thinking about what that long telegram might be. So over to you folks in terms of questions. Please just self-identify with your name, quick in the question, because I think we've got a great opportunity to hear from the great seer himself. You, sir, on the right, and then you. Yeah, that's you, sir. Yeah.
Is there a mic? Yes. Is this on?
Yeah.
All right. I'm Ron Tiersky from Amherst College. I've read your work for a long time.
Thank you.
And also appreciate what Kevin Rudd has been doing here. This is a question about leadership. You started talking a little bit about the difference between democratic society, democratic leadership, and the Chinese single-party regime. Is it, do you have a thought about which kind of leadership would be, let's say, most likely to avoid war, wiser? The Chinese want to say that their system produces more capable, experienced leaders. We know what's happening in our country. It's a kind of black swan presidency. What would be your thoughts on that?
I think I'll take two questions in a row, and we'll have the other question too.
Thank you very much. This is a really, really interesting topic. I wonder, globalization on the one side, economic nationalism on the other side. Economic nationalism would seem to be on the side of war. Supply chains never existed before, given the Walmart example. And the other thing is the massive inflow to the United States of Chinese students. I mean, just massive. Right. Many universities have 40% Chinese. That very, very different than all these others. I would argue these things are different, and I would argue then against war.
Okay, those two questions, Graham.
Two good points. So maybe I start with I go the first one and then the second one. So I argue, this is a long point, but I'll just try to make it brief for the timing. I argue in the book that let me take 1 minute. Okay, so let's imagine there were adult supervision in the world. We know there's not. Okay, there are only people like Trump and Xi. So there's nobody superior to a president of the U.S. or a president of China. But I imagine that there were a Martian strategist who were an adult, and imagine she parachuted into Mar-a-Lago for the summit between Trump and Xi and said, guys, hold on for a minute. Let me make a few points. First, each of you has overwhelming problems that I think you're not going to be capable of solving, and therefore are going to fail with respect to, for each of you. And I'm going to give you a list of 19 of them, each. Second, all of these problems I just described to you occur within your own border. Nothing to do with each other. You have problems with each other too. I'm going to come to that, but let's start with the priority problems. At the top of the list of your domestic problems is that I don't believe you're going to be capable of governing yourself. So you, Trump, have a dysfunctional democracy. You, Xi, have a retro-authoritarian structure when you're trying to revive a party that's going to be the vanguard or the mandarins. And I don't think either of you are going to succeed with that. Okay? And if you fail to govern yourself, the rest of the problem was going to be downhill. And succeeding in governing yourself is going to be essential for anything else that happens internationally. So that's what I say in the book in terms of a conclusion. For Americans, and this is a hard thing for me because I'm very red-blooded, even red-necked American. I know democracy is the best form of government, and I know that I would never sell the U.S. short. But I think I wrote about DC as an acronym for dysfunctional capital long before Donald Trump arrived there. So we should look at our own system, I believe, and say our current democracy as it's functioning is not functioning, not succeeding. Not been succeeding under Obama, not succeeding under his predecessor. And we have serious problems to try to ask how can we fix this for ourselves, nothing to do with China or anybody else. And if we don't succeed in doing that, we have no chance to play the role we could play in the world. If we do, well, then we have big challenges in the world too. And I think the same thing is the case for Xi Jinping. So to your specific question, I mean, if you imagine you're the Asia Society or you're Harvard University or you're a corporation, and you pick your leader just out of whatever, whoever appeals to whomever, they pick them. The Chinese would say about that, and most GE or Google would say, no, wait a minute, you don't just pick people out of wherever. They have to go through they have to be trained to this level, and they have to perform at this level, and they do. So the Chinese have a very elaborate personnel system in which Xi Jinping had to prove himself at 7 different levels before he got to the position that he's in. So I would think normally, in terms of organizations, experience-based selection processes will turn out to be superior to, I don't know, lotteries or whatever, or the American version of that. So I would say I at least would put question marks about both the American thing, but if I were talking to Xi Jinping about this, he would say the idea that communism nobody believes in, so that's been buried. But nonetheless, you have something you call the Communist Party. More and more, I think they're going to drop communism and just call it the capital P Party. Okay, and you're saying about the party, we believe that party members should be more virtuous than the rest of the society. We should be the vanguard. We should be like the mandarins, and everybody else should defer to us. And we do a good job, and so you should be happy. That was Lee Kuan Yew's attempt to develop an idea like that, and I think there's some plausibility to it. But in a world in which, as Lee Kuan Yew said, everybody has smartphones and people are wealthier, and they come to think, well, why should you run things? Why should I not have some say? The dynamic of that is pretty hard to hold together. So I think that I wouldn't feel confident about the Chinese governance now, and I think that's part of the reason why they're relying so much more on nationalism, which brings me to the second gentleman's comment, just briefly. So on the one hand, I agree with you, you've got globalization. On the other hand, in China, if you look especially at the younger population and you look at the social media where people have pretty free levels of expression, nationalism is huge and rising, huge and rising. Chinese are proud to be Chinese. Now, why should you be proud to be Chinese? Excuse me. In the last 30 years, in one generation, go back 1 generation, the parents that people can remember, 97 out of 100 people were poor. And now 3 out of 100 are poor. Well, the world never saw something like this.
Tell the folks about your radio interview yesterday. Oh. The lady from Ohio. I think it's a terrific story.
Yesterday was, I started this rollout, and so I did 9 events yesterday, so a little bit hazy, but I was on, I don't know, one of the radio shows, and so a lady calls in and she says, I'm from Iowa. And she said, and I have a question for you. And she said, I'm married to a Chinese who's now a Chinese American, my husband. And I said, well, that seems fantastic, and she said, and he's becoming more and more Chinese. and more proud of China. And I said, that's understandable because, China is becoming more successful. And she says, and he's now telling me I should become more Chinese. So I think I'm now in the marriage counseling business. So I said, trying to pivot to this gentleman's comment, I said, well, this is fantastic. This is the kind of the ability to have understanding both from Chinese perspective and from American perspective how to get over these problems in a globalized world. But I figuring I should get off to the next topic where I'm more comfortable.
Now, the culture factor speaks volumes through all of that. A couple more questions. Sir, and then Josette, if it's okay. I'll come back to you, sir.
You identified Korea as the likely flashpoint, not the Spratlys. So just to get very practical about all this, do you see a possible deal with China, not North Korea, but with China, with respect to North Korea, that could work us through this?
And Josette, down here. Is a mic.
The ambassador here.
No, I'm coming over here next. Yeah.
And I'm not being rude. I'm just tweeting you, but
Hey,
on my phone here. But so, would you say in the last 4 months we've gotten closer to or farther from the Thucydides trap? And if you were to advise America on how to ward against it, what are some of the key points you would emphasize in American approach to China?
So the two actually fit together very well. So closer to Thucydides' trap. I think Thucydides is sitting on the edge of his chair watching this. And as I say this book was finished before our election. And actually after the election I thought, oh my goodness, I have to now go back and try to take account of, I went through a week of depression. And finally my publisher helped me by saying, leave the book as it is. We're not changing the book, okay? But I put in the foreword of the book just a little bit. That's the only place Trump's name appears. And I say, if Hollywood were making a blockbuster pitting China against the U.S. on the road to war, Central Casting could not have imagined a better lead for Team America than Donald Trump. And actually, the similarities, I try to do a little bit, between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, most people don't appreciate. Long before Donald Trump announced his moniker or our motto, Make America Great Again, Xi Jinping in 2012 announced what would be in colloquial call Make China Great Again. It's called the Great Rejuvenation of the Great China. And for Chinese, the proposition is, wait a minute, we were great for 5,000 years. There was then this 200-year detour. And it only occurred because Westerners like you came and intervened in China and exploited us and even colonized us. And basically, that was the diversion. That's the exception. We're simply getting back to the way things were. So this is like the restoration. So I would say to that, to the Korean case, this is a long story, but I'll try to do the short version. And in fact, I have an op-ed in the New York Times today on the topic that'll give my view. I think this is the most dangerous current situation immediately today, and is the most likely path in which you could actually find Americans and Chinese killing each other this year or next year, which is hard to believe, but let me tell you how the story goes. So, North Korea, a little, small, inconsequential, impoverished land, as we know, has acquired nuclear weapons. The U.S. said they could not do that. They have.
Serbia with nukes.
North Korea has developed missiles that can attack South Korea. The U.S. said you couldn't do that. North Korea has developed missiles that can attack Tokyo. We said you couldn't do that. So the U.S. has repeatedly said to North Korea, and China has also said to North Korea, no, no, no. Here's a red line, here's a red line, here's a red line. Each time North Korea simply just kept moving ahead. So in the months immediately ahead, I call this a Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion. So the first book I wrote was about the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was the case study. You won't remember, maybe, but let me just remind you. In 1962, Soviet Union was placing nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba. John Kennedy was president, and he took what he thought was a 1 in 3 chance of nuclear war. Excuse me, a 1 in 3 chance of nuclear war to prevent North Korea, to prevent Soviet Union from placing nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba. And he, in the course of it, almost had a heart attack, because anybody would do is you looked at this and say, holy Moses, 1 in 3 chance of nuclear war, this has got to be crazy. Okay? And there's a great conversation between him and his brother in the middle of it, in which they're basically asking each other, do we know what we've gotten into? And that causes them to become hugely creative in the last chapter, which I'll leave that for aside. In the case of North Korea, in the months, not 13 days, that was in 1962, but the next 13 months, North Korea is going to acquire the ability to strike San Francisco or Los Angeles with a nuclear warhead, unless they're interrupted. So from the first instant he heard about this, as president-elect, in his meeting with President Obama. So President Obama said to Trump in their first meeting, I'm telling you, your big crisis is going to be North Korea. Trump had never heard of North Korea. Okay? What is the crisis? The crisis is these guys are going to have the ability to strike San Francisco and Los Angeles and Seattle with nuclear weapons. And Trump tweeted right after the meeting, never going to happen. And he said every day since then, this is not going to happen while Donald Trump is president of the United States. You can count on that. So now at Mar-a-Lago, he said to Xi Jinping, this is not a hard problem. You can solve this problem. But if you don't solve this problem, I will solve this problem, and you're not going to like it. So take that home, okay? That's it. And as Kevin knows, he and I both been part of this postmortems for Mar-a-Lago. The Chinese got the message, but they are thinking, wait a minute, nobody else has been able to solve this problem. And now at this point, you're making this the defining issue in the relationship between China and the U.S. And then if we fail to solve the problem, you're going to blame us, and then you're going to do something like attack North Korea. Now, can Trump order an attack on North Korea just like the attack he ordered after the chocolate cake was served at Mar-a-Lago against Syria? You bet. And if he does, will we attack North Korea? We will. And can we prevent them conducting missile tests by attacking it? We can. But what's going to happen then? So every time we've looked at this case before, the American intelligence community has said, North Korea is going to respond by attacking Seoul and probably killing about 1 million people in the first 24 or 48 hours. Well, the South Koreans have a heart attack. Okay? Every president of South Korea has called up the president of the U.S. and said, do not do it. 1 million people in Seoul, do not do it. Okay? And he'll get a phone call that'll say that. But is that going to be sufficient for Trump? I don't know. Okay? And if they were to attack Seoul, what is the U.S. and South Korea going to do? We're going to go and destroy every missile and rocket and piece of artillery in North Korea that could kill the next 10 million people in South Korea. Of course we will. I mean, if we didn't, what are we going to do? Say, well, 1 million people died, it's not so bad? No. So there'll be a war. This is called a Second Korean War. And I have a good chapter, or not a chapter, but a section in the book called The First Korean War, again, which Americans should read about. Most people don't remember. In the First Korean War, the U.S. was just about, with South Korea, to reunify the country as MacArthur marched rapidly towards the border with China on the Yalu River, basically thinking Americans were going to be home for Christmas. That's in 1950. And lo and behold, China entered the war. A weak China, which Mao had even hardly consolidated control of his own country, against the world supremo, who had just 5 years before ended World War II by dropping bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and stunned MacArthur, completely stunned, and beat the U.S. right back down the peninsula to the 38th parallel, where the things stand now. So I would say, watch this space. This is a Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion, where you can see the parties moving inexorably to this collision. Yeah.
That's such and we're privileged to hear this expounded so elegantly, because what Graham's pointed to is the classic wargaming and game theory at a foreign policy and national security policy level about how one perception and one action procreates the next and the next and the next against an entirely credible set of scenarios. And before I call on the ambassador, one thing which deeply troubles me in dealing with Chinese perceptions of all of this is as follows. I believe our Chinese friends do not believe it is faintly credible or possible that a US administration would take such an action unilaterally against North Korean capabilities, because in the Chinese wargaming of it, the game theorization of it, they have concluded that the resulting damage to Seoul and South Korea will be of such an order of magnitude of itself to cause the Americans never to consider doing it, let alone doing it. And in the current set of circumstances, that may be a false perception. And that, in terms of the perceptions debate between Washington and Beijing at present over the real and living emerging Cuban crisis in slow motion, is one of the threshold points we are facing at the moment, reinforced by one other factor, which is when you say to our Chinese friends, US administrations have a deep interest in the well-being of their allies. That's proven. I won't reflect on Germany. But in the current state of German-US relations. But if we reach the point which Graham has just pointed to about the imminent acquisition of a capability not just to target, damage and threaten an American ally, but to target, damage and threaten the continental United States, this creates an entirely different calculus in the way in which administrations period, and I presume this one, would then balance their perception of what to do. I'm affected by what would happen to Korea. I'm affected in my thinking about what would happen to Japan and the result of North Korean reaction to a unilateral American attack. I'm really affected by what could unfold in terms of a threat directly to the United States. Ambassador, and we'll close it with these two sets of questions. Ambassador first.
Yeah, I'm a Korean Consul General based in New York. And actually,
can you hold it up to your mouth,
yeah,
sir?
very happy to meet you in person in Asia Society. Actually, I mail ordered your book 2 months ago, so I'm really happy to meet you in person here. My question is about North Korea again, on your view, or whether it could pose only a Thucydides trap of war, or an issue of collaboration between China, United States and China. Actually, Xi Jinping striving to build a major country relations with the United States. Actually, that's the way make China great again, together with United States. So, North Korean issue is, the United States put all options on the table, including military option, but it seems to me that United States more focused on diplomatic pressure, including international sanctions, to make meaningful dialogue happen. So not only a military option, but also dialogue. But a pending situation is that United States more focused on pressure on North Korea and China. So it could make a great path of collaboration, not a Thucydides trap.
Thanks, Excellency. And last question here, sir.
Thank you so much. My name is Ian Hansen. I'm president of Psychologists for Social Responsibility. I'm a social psychologist at York College. I actually heard about the theme of your book. First time this winter while I was in China teaching peace psychology at Nanjing Normal University, and I'd been trying to illustrate for the students the potentiality of peace and the ways in which peace can accomplish great things and prevent war and prevent atrocities even. And one of my students said, well, it looks like usually when a great power is rising or is threatened by a rising power, war is inevitable. So how are we going to handle that? So your book is very apropos, and I'm very glad to be here. There are a couple of points that are raised in your book. I want to get to the away from the analytics. I understand the diagnosis is necessary before prescription.
Yeah.
But yes, quickly, it seems like that you mentioned there are two factors. One is the rise, and the other is the fear. And insofar as that's the problem, we live in a society that's very ruled by fear, and fear seems to be underlining a lot of what we do, and fear seems to have facilitated the rise of Donald Trump. And the antidote to fear is courage, and the courage to say no, including no to the orders of somebody who might command the button. And Donald Trump doesn't push the button himself. He orders somebody else in a room to push the button, to which you can say no. And I hope that in general there can be a lot more saying of no to the changes that are happening that are sort of turning our democracy into a dictatorship.
I got it. Okay. I'll try to be quick since I think we're at the end. For those who have great fears about Donald Trump, which I think include many, many people in the U.S. as well as the world, the appointment of H.R. McMaster as his national security advisor, somebody whom I know extremely well, who's a great pain in the ass for anybody for whom he's ever worked, because he's a very straight shooter. He's he's a wonderful person to have working for you, who's a pain in the ass and worth it, okay? Because he'll tell you every time he disagrees. Okay? The Secretary of Defense, Mattis, who's also, he's a Munk scholar. He's got a great library, more than 7,000 books. He reads Thucydides all the time and thinks about Thucydides. So a great choice. And similarly, Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State. So you have three serious adults that are part of this national security group. That's on the one hand, and that's, I think, comforting. On the other hand, if after full deliberation, the President of the U.S. decides to attack North Korea, he doesn't have a button that he pushes. He gives an order, and that order will be executed. I have no doubt whatever, 100%. That order will be executed. It's conceivable if somebody disagreed strongly enough, they might resign. That's okay. That's happened before in the U.S. government. Cyrus Vance, the Secretary of State, resigned after the Iran issue. So it's perfectly possible. But I think do not take comfort that the chain of command is going to say no. We have a civilian control of the military. We have a president that's legitimately elected. If he makes an order, even if it's a mistake, we do it. Okay, that's to the ambassador's question. I think it's just right. So one can either tell the story of why the North Korean incident could and should become the basis in which China and the U.S. recognize that their common interests are so overwhelming that this pipsqueak of a problem should be resolvable if they were adults. So again, imagine my Martian strategist. So she comes down and she says, guys, sit down. This is not that hard. There are options for solving this problem. You're not going to like them. They're not as good as what you might wish for, but they're way better than finding yourselves at war. So notice, this problem could lead. On the other hand, historically, there's not been this adult supervisor. And governments have behaved the way governments behaved in 1914. And if in this case we have business as usual, which I fear we may do, I think we could easily see history as usual.
We've been treated to an extraordinary exposition this morning, and I think when we reflect back on this discussion this morning, we will understand its significance. The question just put from our social psychologist friend, I think, is a fascinating one. Chinese have a term which means a lot within their system and is kind of brushed away in ours, which is just simply called 我们的思维跟你们的思维不一样. Our way of thinking is different to the way in which you think. And this actually imports within it a whole series of civilizational, cultural, and frankly, strategic concepts which partly overlap with traditions we're intellectually familiar with in the West and the United States and partly don't. And here's the idealist posit within that, and I'm basically, a realist idealist, is can a way of thinking be changed by either leadership or by other positive forces? And that's an open question for statesmanship, which must be based, however, on common analytical frameworks of the nature of the problem. That's why the analytics here are so important. Second point, mine's kind of a concluding question for Graham to muse on, because he refers to these interrelatedly in the book. You have a Thucydidean view of the world, the Thucydides trap, and the scholarship underpinning this is formidable. It's a form of what I would describe as semi-historical determinism. Graham will dispute that, but it basically says it's pointing in a particular direction, the forces are at work, the two forces are established powers and rising powers, and here are the external barometers. How do we change course, or at least adjust course? So if you'd overlay that with two other sets of theories which dance around the pages of the book, which is Huntingtonianism and Clash of Civilizations, where we are dealing not with an Anglo-American, shall I say, gentleman's agreement in the late 19th century and early 20th century, which essentially went along these lines. My dear chap, we've never forgiven you for the revolution, but basically you're one of ours. Okay. That was essentially the nature of the transfer. With a 5,000-year-old Chinese civilization and the American Republic, I think it's a different discourse. So if you're within the grand theory here, Graham, we're putting together Thucydides and history and semi-determinism, and Sam Huntington, who you knew and who I've always vehemently opposed, but at the same time been a keen reader of, in terms of the inevitable destination point of clashes of civilizations. There's that factor as well, because we're dealing with different civilizational canons. And there's the third part of Graham's own personal canon, which is this, essence of decision, which is actually the dynamics which apply within regime theory and decision-making dynamics, drawing upon his great scholarship on the Cuban Missile Crisis, where you see the current reflection on it and what he described as the dynamics associated with the possibilities of a Second Korean War. That is how one thing leads to another, and where the decisions surrounding each step of the process actually create the next set of realities, until someone decides to either blink or reach a common understanding of how to change course. So my prediction, folks, is that, and that's a set of questions for us to reflect on in the future, because I think there are three elements to the analytics and possibly to the prescriptives as well for the future. My prediction, by the way, is this will not be just seen as a good book. I think this will be seen as a great book. I mean that. I don't agree with all of it. I agree with a fair bit of it. In fact, the bulk of it. But I see this also in the subject area which is near and dear to my own heart, and anyone who cares about the future of the world, and the future of America, and the future of China, as I think the preface for the next version of Kennan's long telegram of 1946. Who writes the telegram and its content and its response remains to be determined. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Graham Allison.
Thank you very much.